The 2024 NBA season is officially underway, and we've already gotten to experience a ton of incredible basketball after the opening slate of games. There is a very long season ahead of us though, and every single team has its own set of expectations with storylines to follow throughout, which brings us to today's video. Today, I will be going through all 30 NBA teams, and I will be giving one bold prediction for every single one of them. Obviously, these predictions will vary in terms of how out there they are, but they're all things that I believe could be coming. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but it also very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. We'll start with the teams in the Eastern Conference, then make our way over to the Western Conference. So the first team up is the Atlanta Hawks, who I believe will have Onyeka Okongwu take Clint Capella's starting center job by the end of the season. Capella still has a lot to offer inside, don't get me wrong, but he's been showing signs of slowing down defensively over the last few seasons, and on the flip side, Onyeka Okongwu is blossoming into an incredible interior defender who is much more versatile than Capella and probably gives them more of what they need right now. Next up is the Boston Celtics, and I believe they will win fewer regular season games this year than they did last year. On paper, the Celtics have a much better team this year after adding Kristaps Porzingis and Jrue Holiday to the mix, but as is always the case with teams bringing in new faces, they will probably experience some inconsistency while figuring out how to play together. Losing Marcus Smart also hurts in the leadership department, and they have less depth this year than they had last year as well. Up next is the Brooklyn Nets, who I believe will be a top 5 ranked defense this season. This group doesn't have many expecting them to do much this season, but if everything goes right, they should be really tough to score on. Nick Claxton is one of the best young interior defenders on the rise, and then Mikal Bridges and Ben Simmons are both former Defensive Player of the Year candidates on the perimeter, so they have bodies to throw at you across the board. Next is the Charlotte Hornets, who I believe will have the worst record in the NBA this season. Someone has to be the team at the bottom of the standings, and with the Hornets' lack of real leadership, inexperience across the board, and off-court distractions, there isn't much to have confidence in from this group right now. Up next is the Chicago Bulls, who I believe will end up trading either Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan, or both this season. This is a team with a very low ceiling that probably needs to rebuild again in the near future, so when the losses start to rack up this season, they'll probably realize that it's best to extract as much value back for their best players to focus on the future. Next up is the Cleveland Cavaliers, who I believe will repeat as the best ranked defense in the NBA this season. The Cavs were the league's best defense last season, and Evan Mobley seems primed for another leap forward that could have him in the Defensive Player of the Year race. Up next is the Detroit Pistons, who I believe will trade Bojan Bogdanovic this season. The Pistons could be ready to make a leap into trying to contend for the play-in tournament this year, but it's not guaranteed, and if they don't make that leap, then teams in contention will once again be on the phone trying to trade for Bogdanovic, who is still an exceptional volume shooter. Next is the Indiana Pacers, who I believe will make the play-in tournament this year. The Pacers fell short of the playoffs and play-in tournament entirely last season, but for the first half of the year, they were firmly in the playoff hunt before injuries started to hit them. So if they can stay healthy, especially after adding Bruce Brown, Obi Toppin, and Jarius Walker to the mix, they should be competitive. Up next is the Miami Heat, who I also believe will be in the play-in tournament this season. For the Pacers, it was intended to be a positive as they're about to take a step forward, but for the Heat here, this is much less thrilling. They made the NBA Finals last season in a miraculous run as the 8th seed, but they had to make it out of the play-in tournament to even get that chance last year, and this offseason, they really didn't make a single big move to bolster their roster, so I don't see much changing for them in the standings, even with their established postseason pedigree. Next is the Milwaukee Bucks, and I believe Giannis Antetokounmpo will win this year's MVP award. I already discussed this in my awards predictions video, but Giannis is still going to have elite production across the board as a scorer and rebounder. He's also still one of the best defenders in the NBA, and the Bucks are going to win a boatload of games with Damian Lillard also now in town. Next is the New York Knicks, who I believe will trade Evan Fournier this season. Fournier was once a reliable volume scorer, but last season he got benched after his shooting touch started to waver, and now he's out of the rotation completely, so it's best for both sides to trade him instead of letting him rot on the bench when he clearly wants to find a team that will play him. Next is the Orlando Magic, and I believe Jalen Suggs will eventually fall out of their rotation. Suggs was a top 5 pick a few years ago, but he has not had a very good start to his career. The Magic have a logjam at point guard as is, and after the team just gave Cole Anthony a contract extension, that seems to be the indicator that they trust him a lot more than Suggs in the long run. Up next is the Philadelphia 76ers, who I believe will trade James Harden to a team that is not the Clippers. The Clippers have really been the only team engaged in trade talks for Harden to this point, but they, just like the Heat did with Damian Lillard, have refused to offer anything even remotely worthwhile for him, so at this point, it just seems like a waiting game for a team to swoop in with even a semblance of a worthwhile offer. Next is the Toronto Raptors, who I believe will blow it up by the trade deadline. The Raptors have steadily been losing key pieces in each of the last few off-seasons, and OG Anunoby seems ready to be next in line, about to hit free agency next summer, so if they can't stay afloat in the standings by then, they definitely could look to offload some of their key pieces. Next is the Washington Wizards, who I believe will be the team's worst ranked defense this season. This is a pretty flawed roster, lacking in the manpower necessary to consistently get stops. They have no discernible size inside, Jordan Poole was shipped out of Golden State pretty much because of his defensive woes, and there just isn't that much talent around him and Kyle Kuzma in general. Now over to the Western Conference, we'll start with the Dallas Mavericks, who I believe will have the league's best ranked offense this season. Luka Doncic has been able to almost single-handedly get the Mavericks into the top 10 of the league offensively, and now with a full season of having Kyrie Irving alongside him, I think we should be expecting fireworks from that duo. Next is the Denver Nuggets, who I believe will repeat as the 1 seed in the Western Conference. The Nuggets are the defending champions, and they returned all 5 of their starters in a conference filled with teams still figuring out how to play together, so the familiarity will result in a ton of regular season wins. Next up is the Golden State Warriors, and I believe Chris Paul will push Klay Thompson to the bench at some point this season. Klay, at this point in his career, is someone who is out there to get his shots up, trying to catch fire. He's still very much an elite shooter, but since the return from his injury, he is way more inconsistent, and his shot selection can get poor at times, so with Chris Paul now in town ready to operate as more of a facilitator, I could see Klay being moved to the 6th man role to ignite the offense off the bench. Next is the Houston Rockets, who I believe will trade Jae'Sean Tate this season. This is Tate's 4th season in Houston, and every year his role seems to get smaller and smaller. With so many new, younger bodies in the rotation, and Tate being 28 years old, he could be traded to a team in need of front-court defense by the deadline. Up next is the Los Angeles Clippers, who I believe will not trade for James Harden. This is a cop-out because I said the same thing for the 76ers earlier in the video, but I truly believe that if the Clippers actually wanted James Harden, they would have had him by now. They feel comfortable with what they have, so all of the rumors about Harden going to LA do not seem likely to come into fruition. Next is the Los Angeles Lakers, who I believe will bench D'Angelo Russell at some point this season. Speaking of inconsistency, D'Angelo Russell embodies streaky play, and he also has a track record of being taken advantage of defensively. I could see LeBron wanting to take over more point guard duties as he gets older, which would allow another defender like Rui Hachimura into the starting lineup to shore up some of their holes. Next is the Memphis Grizzlies, who I believe will have a winning record when Ja Morant returns from his suspension. With Ja Morant out for the first 25 games of the year, most seem to be predicting a slide from the Grizzlies, but the team has a record of 37 wins and 24 losses in games that Morant has missed throughout his career, not missing a beat without him, so trust them to continue holding down the fort until he's back. Up next is the Minnesota Timberwolves, who I believe will miss the playoffs this season. The Western Conference has so many teams in the hunt this year, and while the Wolves are excited about a potential Anthony Edwards breakout, they still have a front court that doesn't really fit next to each other, with Karl Anthony Towns and Rudy Gobert holding each other back. Next is the New Orleans Pelicans, who I believe will be a top 4 seed in the West. This is a team that missed the playoffs entirely last year, which would make this a pretty big leap, but in the first half of the season when Zion Williamson was healthy, they were actually sitting in first place for a while, so barring yet another devastating Zion injury, I think they can make a lot of noise. Next is the Oklahoma City Thunder, who I believe will make a blockbuster trade at the trade deadline this year. The Thunder are really in a great position right now, with a hungry young team on the rise and a treasure chest of assets at their disposal. If they see a realistic path to contention during the year and a star becomes available on the trade market, I could absolutely see them pouncing on that opportunity. Next is the Phoenix Suns, who I believe will see Devin Booker average a career high in assists this season. The Suns are all in on their trio of him, Kevin Durant, and Bradley Beal, but they don't really have a point guard in their rotation, so Devin Booker will be handling the ball a lot, and I believe he's going to show that he can be a facilitator and a scorer in this role. Up next is the Portland Trail Blazers, who I believe will have the worst record in the Western Conference. The Blazers did the right thing this summer by trading Damian Lillard away and focusing on their future, but with the amount of youth now running the show, they're not going to be winning all that much. Next is the Sacramento Kings, who I believe will miss the playoffs this year. I know this is an unpopular opinion, but as I've said a few times now, the West has so many teams that can capably contend for a spot in the playoffs, and it's hard to believe that the Kings will have a record-breaking offensive season 2 years in a row like they had last year to mask their woeful defense. Up next is the San Antonio Spurs, and I believe Victor Wembanyama will make an all-defense team this season as a rookie. Wembanyama is going to have a lot of growing pains offensively this year, but defensively, he's going to be using that 8-foot-long wingspan he has to block a lot of shots and force a lot of misses around the basket right away. And finally, the last team is the Utah Jazz, and I believe John Collins will have an emergence similar to Lauri Markkanen this season. Markkanen entered the Jazz last year in a familiar way to Collins doing so this year as a once promising young talent who got cast away and then unleashed in Utah when utilized correctly. Collins was once a 20-10 guy, and he's going to get the chance to show that side of his game again this year. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below some of your bold predictions for the season. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.